Steve Silberman is an award-winning science writer and the author of the New York Times bestselling NeuroTribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity, which unearths the secret history of autism and features an introduction by the late neurologist and author Oliver Sacks. Among many other major awards, the book received the Samuel Johnson Prize for Nonfiction, the first popular science book to win the prize in its 17-year history, and is now translated into 16 languages. Silberman's articles on science, music, art, and culture have appeared in Wired, The New Yorker, the MIT Technology Review, Nature, The Believer, Salon, Shambhala Sun, and many other publications. As a young man, Silberman worked as a teaching assistant to poet Allen Ginsberg. He also co-produced the Grateful Dead's box set, So Many Roads, 1965 to 1995, which was Rolling Stone's box set of the year. His Twitter feed is @Steve Silberman, and he lives with his husband, Keith Carricker, in San Francisco.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Our host, Raymond Foye, is a writer, curator, editor, and publisher based in New York City. He's a consulting editor of the Brooklyn Rail. He has worked for City Lights Books, New Directions, and Petersburg Press, and from 1986 to 1996, he was the editor and publisher with Francesco Clemente of Hanuman Books. From 1990 to 1995, he worked as director of exhibitions and publications at Gagosian Gallery in New York. His recent projects include the collected poems of Bob Kaufman, co-edited with Tate Swindle for New Directions. He organized the first exhibition of the works of legendary underground filmmaker and painter Jordan Belson for Matthew Marks Gallery in 2019, and is working on a comprehensive monograph on Belson's work. Currently, he is preparing an edition of Gregory Corso's last poems from 1980 to 2000 for New Directions, and the collected poems of Rene Ricard to be published in 2020. All right, now I will hand over the virtual mic to you, Raymond, and we'll get the conversation started.
Thanks. The Bob Kaufman book was published by City Lights, although he is published by New Directions, and I'm co-editing the Gregory Corso book with George Scrivani, just to give credit where credit is more than due. So, Steve, it's great to be here with you this afternoon. And when Fong asked me if I wanted to do one of these programs and asked me who I wanted to have on, you were the first person who came to mind, because I wanted to go a little bit outside of some of the people who the Rail has been talking to. And your book, aside from the fact that you're one of my best and oldest friends in life, your book, NeuroTribes, to me is one of the most important books on human consciousness and the mind of the last 10 years, or frankly, of all time. It's a remarkable book, a very, very important book. And I urge everybody to get a copy and read it if you haven't already. You, as your introduction notes, cover a lot of bases, but just to start with NeuroTribes, that is a book that gave a place and a name and a voice to an entire group of people who were not acknowledged, or if they were considered aberrant in some way. It also redefines this notion of normal, or questions why normal should in fact even be a high standard or in the first place. I wonder if you could give me a little encapsulation about NeuroTribes, how it came about, and just what the general thesis of the book is.
Sure. Way back in 2001, I wrote one of the first articles about autism in high-tech communities like Silicon Valley. And at that point, the number of diagnoses was soaring. And that was always sort of explained or not explained in mainstream news coverage as a mystery or a puzzle or a baffling enigma. And at the time, there was a lot of rumors about vaccines or computer screens, radiation, or causing this in high-tech communities. But when I looked at it for Wired magazine, it seemed to me what was happening was that high-tech communities like Silicon Valley had become kind of natural sanctuaries for people with autistic traits. I don't go as far as to say that, all these computer programmers have autism, but there are a lot of autistic traits among the people who work in high-tech communities. And eventually what started happening was they would have autistic kids if they met one another, kids who were diagnosable. And so there was this rumor that there was, quote unquote, an epidemic of autism, as someone put it to me, in high-tech communities. But when I looked, it appeared that what was happening was that people who had certain genetic characteristics that actually gave them advantages in high-tech communities, like certain kinds of intense focus, certain kinds of commitment, certain kinds of not caring so much about going out to the bar with the cool kids on Friday night, that these were actually advantageous qualities to have if you were a computer programmer or working in a high-tech community. And the more that I looked at that over the course of really the next 15 years, after my article, The Geek Syndrome, came out in Wired, I got email almost every week from autistic people and their families. And most of the emails were about very basic problems in access, like accessing jobs, accessing healthcare, being able to get through a face-to-face interview when that's not something that many autistic people can do gracefully. Meanwhile, the whole world was becoming obsessed with autism, but it was becoming obsessed with a different question. Do vaccines cause autism? And in fact, they don't, as has been proven over and over again. But I wondered why this question was never put to rest, why it was always a baffling enigma. And what I discovered by going into the very deep history of autism, going all the way back to its discovery in the 30s and 40s, was that the history of the discovery of autism had been wrong. And what the story that was told in thousands of textbooks and Wikipedia was simply incorrect. And if you understood the correct timeline of autism's discovery, you would understand why the numbers started shooting up so dramatically in the 1990s. And, you know, I thought the book would take me about 1.5 years to write. It took me 5 years because I ended up figuring out that a lot of the reasons why we didn't know what the true prevalence of autism was for most of the 20th century was World War II and the Holocaust. So I had to do research on, you know, the ascent of the Nazis in Austria and Germany. And it turned into not just a science book about autism, but a social justice book about the journey of a tribe of people who had been rendered invisible, basically, by a series of mistakes or cover-ups or errors in the transmission of history. So that's what NeuroTribes is. And if anybody wants a 10-minute version of what I discovered, I did a TED Talk called The Forgotten History of Autism that people can see. But
yes, I highly recommend that.
Yeah, but it was a very intense, you know, it became an obsession, one might say, for me. And that you know, we're all in lockdown now. I haven't left the house in weeks. It was pretty much that way for 5 years. I was writing NeuroTribes. It's not so unusual for me to be in the house, you know. So yeah, so that's what happened. And so a science book ended up becoming a social justice story, really. And then it came out in 2015. I thought everyone would hate it. I thought the anti-vaccine people would hate it, which they did, by the way. But it turns out that people liked it, and I feel very lucky. And it went all over the world.
Well, another thing that should be said about that book is that it's an extraordinarily well-written book, and you are a fabulous writer, one of the most skilled writers I know, one of the most intelligent people I know. And it's an amazing piece of writing. It's great storytelling. It's compelling. I described it the other day as being like reading a volume of Chekhov short stories. And wow. I think this thing about storytelling is very important to the subject of clinical medicine and yes. How you create a narrative for the person who you're giving the diagnosis to, but also for everyone else, for the doctors, for the public. And I think the real mentor in this regard is Oliver Sacks, isn't he?
Oh, absolutely. Well, what Oliver really did was to recenter storytelling in medicine. And so you might ask, why did it go away? If you think about it, before the invention of antibiotics, there really weren't any medicines that that definitely worked. You know, I mean, lots of things can work via the placebo effect, which is not just some psychological thing, but an actual physical, I've written about it actually. It's an actual physical healing process that gets booted up when you're given something that you think is medicine. So I don't write off the placebo effect and things like acupuncture as a minor thing. It can really work for stuff like inflammation and whatnot. But what it doesn't do is kill viruses and bacteria. And so before antibiotics, medicine was part of a story that the doctor would give you to interpret your symptoms and in a way that they made sense to you. And so if you needed to make changes in your life or take a particular remedy or whatever, it would make sense to you why you were doing it. And what Oliver pointed out was that the great clinical observers before the invention of modern medicine were storytellers. And they were excellent storytellers in the same way that excellent novelists and excellent poets are storytellers. They very precisely observe the world in front of their eyes. And in this case, the doctor very precisely observes the patient's behavior. And Oliver wouldn't just see people in his office. He would go to their house and listen to them play piano or watch them catch a ball. And by doing so, he understood the entire context of the patient's life in a way so that the whatever syndrome he was writing about became illuminated by who they were, not just applying a label to a person. And so Oliver was very definitely an influence and an inspiration in that regard. And I became friends with him because of the article, The Geek Syndrome. His assistant called me. I was literally on my way to the airport to go to New York. His assistant called me and said, "Hi, I'm the assistant to Oliver Sacks, and I just wanted you to know that Dr. Sacks really liked your article, The Geek Syndrome." And so I sort of invited myself to go see them. And then he walked into his office. He was wearing a bathing suit because he went swimming every day, so this eminent, author was standing there in his bathing suit. And I asked him what he was up to next, and he said that he was going to London the following week to do a book tour for his the first part of his autobiography, which is called Uncle Tungsten. And so I ended up kind of going to London with him on a separate plane and having these deep adventures. And we ended up becoming friends, which didn't usually happen with people that I wrote about. But in his case, I actually figured out that he was a closeted gay man in the course of writing a profile of him for Wired called The Fully Immersive Mind of Oliver Sacks. And it ended up that he needed some help kind of accepting himself after his mother had told him that he was an abomination that she wished had never been born when he came out to her as a young man. And so he was really traumatized by that in a lifelong way. And by meeting me and my husband, Keith, we were able to help him and encourage him and give him some sense that he might someday fall in love, and he eventually did. He met a wonderful young man named Billy Hayes, who wrote a book about their time together called Insomniac City. And Billy is, gorgeous, brilliant, a great writer, had already written a book that Oliver much admired about Grey's Anatomy. And so Oliver and I became really good friends. And then he wrote the introduction to this book. And many of the things in the book that I discovered through historical research, I would see that Oliver had figured it out intuitively already, like the way that he approached Temple Grandin, who was really the first autistic person, the first autistic adult to come out in history. She came out a couple of years after Raymond. Raymond was, of course, about a fictional character played by Dustin Hoffman, but Temple was the genuine article. And Oliver wrote a profile of her for the New Yorker that was so knowing of so many aspects of not just autistic experience, but human experience, and rendered her in full. And it was amazing to me as I wrote NeuroTribes to discover how much Oliver had just figured out using his intuition and his powers of observation.
Yes, yes. Well, I think one has that experience all the time with poets as well, poets and artists. They seem to be, Sigmund Freud once said, every time I get to a new place, I find a poet has been there first.
Oh, interesting.
Now,
Wow.
yeah. You mentioned Oliver and his homosexuality. It's an interesting parallel to NeuroTribes, in that when you and I were growing up, homosexuality was still considered a form of pathology by the medical profession, and doctors were taught to diagnose it in that way and to attempt to cure people. So there is that parallel, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. I remember when I first started to figure out that I was gay, which was probably in 7th grade or something, or 6th grade maybe. I remember like lying awake in Queens, where I grew up, thinking like, maybe science will save me, like telling that to cure. And my parents actually did send me to a therapist for the cure when I came out to them in high school. And so it was definitely one of the things that I think prepared me for writing NeuroTribes and for seeing autism in a social justice context rather than just a scientific or medical or epidemiological context, was that experience of being gay. Because autism is a diagnosis. It doesn't exist outside of ourselves, like some living thing. It's a description. It's a constellation of behavior, and that constellation of behavior is codified in a document called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Well, homosexuality was in the DSM as well, up through the time that you and I were in high school. I think you and I are about the same age. We might be a few months apart, but we basically grew up into the same world. And so I definitely, I didn't go through any kind of religious guilt about homosexuality, thank God, because my parents were like Marxists, basically. They were communists who were anti-war activists in the 60s, new leftists, but they were very homophobic, like many of their leftist colleagues. And, I remember them calling people dykes and all this. But luckily, my family also had a history of going up to Provincetown in Massachusetts. And so at the same time, while they were in New York, they'd be talking about dykes, and whatnot. Then we'd go up to Provincetown, and these two lovely lesbian women owned the house that we rented every summer, and they were like my godparents. And so I ended up with this sort of view that it could be a positive, that gay people might actually be human and loving and soulful creatures, And so that gave me a pathway to coming out. And I eventually taught my parents that homophobia was more like racism or anti-Semitism than it was like, something smart and good. And so they eventually changed their attitudes and behavior and came to my wedding with Keith, and it was actually a wonderful thing.
Yeah, nice. Well, I guess what we're talking about is how you change society as an individual, as an artist, as a poet, as a writer. And we do that in different ways than people who take other forms of social action. But I've always believed in that path of the counterculture. And I guess this is a good way to segue into your early relationship with Allen Ginsberg, because he really is, he's a formative person in my life and your life as well. That's another thing we share. And I want to know, what was your earliest experiences of Allen and the Beats growing up? These, was it the City Lights books, the fantasy records? These were signposts to a completely new way of living and behaving. What did Allen mean to you growing up, and how did you come to get to know him personally?
Well, as I mentioned, my parents were anti-war activists. So I remember seeing, some guy in a white schmata or something, with a beard, who would go to rallies. So I knew he was important. But my sense was that my parents, who were very serious, kind of button-down, cigarette-smoking Marxists, thought he was somehow frivolous or something. He was like a hippie or whatever. But I had an uncanny experience when I was very young that sort of foreshadowed my later life, including my later attraction to Ginsberg, which is that one day when I was in that apartment in Queens, in Fresh Meadows, actually, I found a bunch of older kids, they seem like adults to me, but they were probably like in their early 20s, in the backyard, and they were like camping in the backyard of our apartment building. And I went back the next day and they were still there. And I realized eventually, like years later, that they were taking LSD a lot. And but I liked them, they liked me. You know, they seemed really cool. They were like lying around on blankets and cutting leaves out of construction paper and putting them in the trees and stuff. And at the end of the day, I brought them up to meet my parents, which was kind of hilarious. And before they left, I said, "Where are you guys from?" Because they seemed to come from some, like they might as well have come from another planet. And this woman said to me, "We're from a place you'll never see, the Haight-Ashbury." And that was like such a, you know, faithful remark. I mean, I've now lived in, I'm here, there now. I've now lived in the Haight-Ashbury for 40 years. But so what happened was my initial literary interest in youth, which was science fiction, actually. I was really into science fiction when I was in elementary school. I ended up getting into science fiction that was kind of mind expanding because it was like the golden age of that. And I would say that my later interests in poetry as a means of transforming consciousness, and also psychedelic drugs as a means of transforming consciousness, came out of that early interest in science fiction, as it did for, I would later find out, so many of the musicians that were involved in it, like David Crosby and Paul Kantner of Jefferson Airplane. They were both way into science fiction, based stuff like wooden ships and communal households on descriptions of communities they saw in the writings of Robert Heinlein. So I would see Allen at rallies, but you know, my parents thought he was frivolous. Then I started reading his poetry, probably in English class in maybe junior high school. And I remember, I think, you know, I probably read Strange New Cottage in Berkeley, or, you know, the oft anthologized pieces. And I related to his sensitive sensibility, like he seemed like heartbreakingly earnest in the same way that I felt myself to be heartbreakingly earnest, and probably every, you know, teenager feels himself to be or herself. But I related to him a lot. And then eventually, once I started reading his stuff about his friends like Neil Cassidy and Jack Kerouac, when he would manifest this sort of love for them, I was figuring out that I was gay. I loved my friends that way. Allen's descriptions of those loves always had a note of sort of hopelessness about them. Like they would never reciprocate exactly with the intensity that Allen wanted, you know, and I related to that too. And so then eventually I went to Oberlin College, and I had my first relationship. And one night, me and my first boyfriend decided we had to get away from college. We were just going to get on a Greyhound bus and go to New York City. So we did. We get there, we get off the bus, we see that Allen is reading at Queens College. And so we go to that reading. We sit in the front row. Allen comes out. The first thing he does is sing Blake's Nurse's Song. And he had with him Stephen Taylor, who was a young man who was not much older than me, and you know, very much kind of my type, like this sensitive long hair, just like my boyfriend sitting next to me. And it was obvious that they loved each other, even though Stephen was straight. But the nonverbal communication between them was absolutely electric and beautiful. And I had never seen a middle-aged man who seemed so completely awake in his body and completely awake to his surroundings. It was like seeing somebody who was not a robot for the first time in my life, practically. And I had a very profound, you know, kind of inexplicable, faithful experience in that, you know, while I'm sitting there watching them, which is, I recognized Allen, as they say in Tibetan Buddhism, as my guru, basically. Like he was the guy. Like, I couldn't explain it, but I knew that I needed to be around him for some reason. And so I said to myself, wherever that guy's going to be next summer, I'll be there too. And if he needs somebody to go out and get, cat litter at the bodega, I'll be that guy, And as it turns out, I was that guy because my poetry teacher, David St. John at Oberlin, said, oh, you're in luck. He teaches every summer at a place called Europa Institute. Well, it was Neuropa, and there was no such thing as Google or the internet. So it took me a month to figure out that it was Neuropa. I sent away for the catalog. I get the catalog. There's like a class with Gregory Corso, Socratic rap. There was a class with William Burroughs on screenwriting. There were courses from, Zen psychotherapists and dancers and stuff. It was like getting a brochure from a better universe kind of thing. So I sold everything I had. First I wrote a note to Allen to get what was called an apprenticeship with him. Never got an answer. But on a chance that, I could actually study with him, I sold everything I had. I went to Europa, found Allen. My first moment of kind of disillusion about him, and because the image of him in my mind was that this lonely, lovelorn guy writing poems in Berkeley. He was surrounded by admirers, he's like a rock star. And so I waited until everyone else left, and I said, "Hi, Allen, I'm Steve Silberman." And he said, "Oh yes, you wrote me that very nice letter. Well, I haven't decided who my apprentices will be yet. Where are you staying?" And I told him. And by the time I got back to this dorm that I was staying in, there was a note that said, "Mr. Ginsberg would like to offer you an apprenticeship." So I went to his apartment, and my life began, really. My life as an adult. And 10 years later, he asked me to be his teaching assistant there. And it was actually Allen that introduced me to you, because I was telling, I forget what I was talking with Allen about, but he said, "Oh, you should know this guy, Raymond Foye." And I actually think he was trying to set us up as a date, which didn't work out, but something much better worked out. And I walked into your room at the Chelsea, and you were playing David Crosby's solo album, "If I Could Only Remember My Name." And I remember I said to you, "Wait a minute, who put this on?" It was like, I couldn't,
On vinyl, of course.
Right, exactly. And I said, "Do you realize what this is?" And you said something like, "Yeah, it's the best record ever made." And I completely agreed. I've been obsessed with that record for years. And so that, needless to say, you and I have even, in a sense, affected that record now, because you introduced me to Crosby, Stills and Nash later. I ended up putting a bonus track on that album called Kids and Dogs. And so, needless to say, it was a very karmic meeting when you and I met.
Well, I think we've always taken popular culture very seriously. Maybe that's not the right way to express it, but we've always treated people like Dylan or Neil Young or Jerry Garcia or David Crosby or Graham Nash as the same way we thought about Emily Dickinson or Poe or Whitman. These are great artists who deserve to be listened to and enjoyed. Okay, so a couple of things that reminds me of. Ginsberg, as I came, and we are born in the same year, 1957, so we kind of have a strong hit of the 60s, but we're too young to catch a bus to Haight-Ashbury, although we want to. I remember watching Allen Ginsberg on the Merv Griffin show when I get home from school as a kid, and he'd be introducing Peter Orlovsky as his husband. And I remember having a personality poster. These were these big black and white posters in the 60s of movie stars and pop stars. One of Allen with a big sign that said "Pot is fun."
Absolutely.
And I think one of the things that the establishment realized they made a big mistake on in the 60s was they let the cat out of the bag in terms of culture messages. I remember sitting as a kid at home watching Walter Cronkite Evening News with my parents. There was an article, there was a broadcast piece about LSD in San Francisco in Haight-Ashbury, and I watched it with such interest. I was probably, I was 10 years old. And when it was over, my mother turned to me and she said, "You'd better never do that." And all I remember thinking was, how can I do that?
Right.
And, these, in contrast, in many ways, is such conservative times today. But I think that the role of the counterculture is a very important one to cultivate and to promulgate, preserve, and that's something that Fong and the Brooklyn Rail and Allen with Naropa, these are all parts of the counterculture, which is this little stream that's going in the opposite direction to mainstream culture. And that's extremely important. There's an incredible diversity to the beat writers. Even the so-called minor beat writers are extremely important, fine writers like Kirby Doyle or Carol Berger. There is a lot of diversity with Mary Baraka and Bob Kaufman and Ted Jones. There's great women poets with Diane DePrima, Joanne Kiger,
absolutely,
Lenore Kandel. I mean, it's an extraordinary. I really don't like the category of beat. It's just so limiting. But it's a remarkable group of people, and it really, to me, always represented the alternative to what I consider to be the meaninglessness of mainstream American literature, for the most part.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Well, Diane DePrima said something in a class at Naropa that really struck me. She was talking about the notion of cool and what cool meant to the early beat people. And she said that basically the culture, the mainstream culture around them was full of fake sentiment. So it's like you turn on the radio and there would be like these hysterical voices, bemoaning some very shallow version of love or whatever. And she was like, no, we're going to turn that off. We're going to turn off the fake sentiment and just talk about what's real. And that really impressed me. And one of the biggest thing, I think daily really about what I learned from Allen. And I'd actually, after I say this, I want to ask you what you feel like you learned from Allen. But one of the things that nobody ever talks about with Allen is I feel like I learned from him to take what I was doing very seriously as a professional. Allen was very much a professional. Like, yes, in some ways his life was a mess and everything, but whenever I saw him engage with media, he was very serious about what he was doing, and he had his trip together. And so, as many people know, he had these file cabinets where he kept all this research about the CIA and global heroin trafficking. And he actually figured out that the CIA was involved in global heroin trafficking, long before anybody admitted it. In fact, when people thought it was ridiculous wacky conspiracy theory, he had all the receipts, as they say now on Twitter, And Allen was very, very serious. And I remember I ended up learning to meditate because Allen told us to in class, and this was the way that he did it. I was in his course at Naropa called The Literary History of the Beat Generation. And, we were all it was suggested that we all sign up for meditation instruction. But, it was a bunch of kids, So Allen said, okay, how many of you signed up for meditation instruction? And only a few hands went up, and he said, you're all amateurs in a professional universe,
Wow.
Wow. And I did not want to be an amateur in a professional universe. So right away, I signed up to get instructions in meditation with my Maizumi Roshi. And I feel like in a lot of ways, my interest in Dharma and Buddhism and sitting was a way to be a professional in a realm where most people were just kind of vaguely mystical, whatnot. Like I really wanted to get serious. And one of the things that I've always not just respected in you, Raymond, but have been inspired by you is how professional you are. You absolutely have your trip together, whether you're working with an artist or a writer or a poet or whatever. Like you do the necessary diligence so that the thing you produce is really solid and really important. And you've given a lot of things to the world that no one even attributes to you because you like to be a behind the scenes person. But behind the scenes, by having your trip together, you have made so many great things happen.
Well, thank you. I want to be anonymous, so I get fewer manuscripts in the mail.
Right, exactly.
No, but when you mentioned what did I learn from Allen, the filing system is really the first thing that came to mind. And, you know, a lot of great books like Acid Dreams, there's so many great books were based on Allen's filing system. Another thing I thought of is that great class at Naropa Institute on Poetics, Beginning Poetics, where he comes in and he says, okay, first rule, brush your teeth twice a day, floss your teeth. And he takes out dental floss and he starts demonstrating how to floss your teeth. And I think the practicality of the guy, because he'd seen so many poets who later in life lost their teeth and it was a problem. So that was, and you could just see these poor kids in poetics class, you know, getting really deflated with this information. There was a practical side to him. Maybe I learned everything from him. Maybe a more interesting question is, what did I learn not to do from him? And maybe there he made himself too accessible. Rene Ricard once said to me, you don't have to do everything that everybody wants you to do. So that thing about not suffering fools gladly and protecting yourself a little bit from the world, maybe I learned that from Allen in a negative way. And two questions came up that when you were speaking, and I don't know which one you want to pursue right now. And I would say we have another, you know, maybe 10 minutes before we open up to questions. But one of them is about your early teachers. I mean, there's Trungpa, there's Mazumi Roshi, there's Richard Baker Roshi. All of them turned out to be rather imperfect and problematic individuals in certain ways. And how do you...
So did Allen.
Yes, sure. What do you make of that, and how do you deal with that? And then another teacher you had a very close relationship with was Philip Whalen, and you recently sent me this incredible interview that you just happened to find sitting in a drawer, a tape that you never transcribed, about the Gallery 6 reading, the famous reading where Allen read Howl for the first time, and Philip Lamantia read the poems of John Hoffman. And let me just pause at this moment so we can acknowledge the recent passing of Michael McClure, who quietly slipped out of existence yesterday. He was a great figure, a great friend of ours, a marvelous poet, a very important playwright. Some of the most profound artistic experiences I've had in my life were sitting in Michael McClure's plays. So let's just say farewell and thank you to Michael McClure. So what do you want to talk about? The teacher problem?
Well, you know, I had to, as you mentioned, a lot of my early teachers turned out to be imperfect in some ways. Allen, you know, how do I put it? He once, you know, I'll tell you an embarrassing story. I wasn't exactly attracted to Allen physically, but I loved him very much, you know, and if he had wanted to have sex with me, I probably would have done it. But the closest that we ever came to that was that we were at a party smoking one of Gregory Corso's truly epic joints, like devastated the party, you know, and Allen like sort of comes up to me and kisses me on the lips and says, "Why don't we get together and fuck sometime?" And I said, "Sure, Allen, anytime," you know, blushing furiously. I was very shy. And he said, and then he looked away and he said, "But there's so little time." Really, Allen, you know, like, I guess I was in the right demographic. You know, he wanted me to, I was a teenager. He wanted me to be available to him, but he didn't necessarily want to be committed to even his own sloppy pass at me, you know?
Yeah.
So I actually learned a lesson, like, don't treat people like that. You know, so I don't. You know?
But I do love their political incorrectness and just what they got away with in those days. I mean, I remember with Gregory Corso being a teaching assistant of his at Naropa Institute, and he walked in the first day and he threw a big bag of marijuana at me. He said, "You're the TA, roll me a joint." Now, if these people were around today, they'd be locked up. And
oh, absolutely.
You know, I really miss the Beats. And it's funny that Allen, Gregory, and Burroughs all died. Allen and Bill just before the turn of the millennium, and Gregory was so looking forward to it, and then he died just after. that, but they were all gone by the time of 9/11. And I really miss their commentary, what their commentary would have been on that moment. Not to mention,
particularly since Allen lived in the frozen zone, he could have walked down to where the towers had been. Can you imagine the poem he would have written about that?
Yeah, well, Burroughs's film, Towers Open Fire, was restored and going to be shown in a screening room in the World Trade Center the evening of the bombing. Okay, now that's a film he made with Anthony Balch, I think his name was, which is about holy war between the West and Islam. And what do you do in a holy war? You knock down the temple. What's the temple today? It's the it's capitalism. So what do you?
It's the Moloch temple. It's the Moloch temple.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the coincidence is actually an ad for that premiere. Yeah, and suddenly it was like a whole continent just wasn't there anymore. But times have changed, and yet you cannot judge those figures by the standards of today because it's completely unfair. And if you're going to do that, it's essentially the end of history. You know, you have to have an understanding of how history has proceeded, and the fact that we may be hipper and know more about the correct way to treat people and proper vocabulary and all of that doesn't make us better than these people.
Well, yeah, I mean, the one thing I was going to say was that, you know, for instance, so Allen, you know, I learned some sort of negative example things from Allen. Maizumi Roshi, the Zen master who founded Los Angeles Zen Center, who taught me how to meditate, he had problems with alcohol, eventually had to go into 12-step, and then died when he had a backslide, went to Japan, drowned in a hot tub after a night of drinking with his brothers. Richard Baker, my teacher at San Francisco Zen Center, had to step down because he had an affair with not one of his students, but a married woman who was married to one of the big donors for Zen Center. So that was a problem. So in a way, you know, I as I went through life, a lot of these people who I looked to as examples turned out to be imperfect in some way. Trungpa had a terrible drinking problem that eventually killed him. And he had been brilliant when I you know, in the early 70s and when I was at Europa. He was an absolutely brilliant lecturer and writer. And you could see his decline on videos over the years, even though some people claimed he wasn't declining. And I grew up in a family with some problems with alcohol and drugs in my parents' lives. And so I saw the kind of denial that could excuse behaviors that were just not tolerable. But eventually what I learned was that stop looking for perfect teachers. That's just a projection. All of these people are on the path with us at the same time, working stuff out. And so I stopped looking for perfect enlightenment outside of sutras. You know, I stopped looking for human beings who had no flaws or who were always awake continuously, or I stopped looking for that and just accepted people with all of their imperfections. And, you know, one Zen master describing his life said, it's one continuous mistake. We're all there, you know, and so there's nobody here but us chickens, really. So I started to understand that people could be very, very inspiring and really fucked up at the same time. And I feel like you probably came to that realization as well in working with these older artists and poets.
Sure. I mean, I'm fine with imperfection at this point. I'm not fine with judgmentalism. So there is a lot one has to accept. And yes, there's been a lot of residual damage that these people have done. They've harmed the cause of Buddhism, no question. But it's not something I'm interested in judging. And what they offered were tools for disarming the psychic demons within that one can employ every single day. And, you know, I do encourage people to get into some form of meditation practice, because if you're not, I think you're really wasting your time in life. It's a process that continues all your life. And it's like psychotherapy, but it's really something that one should get into. I think. Now,
and I feel like, you know, that Allen's biggest gift to me was probably the biggest gift that I ever got from anybody, which was to learn how to meditate. He sort of shamed me to learning how to meditate. But more than that, he clued me in as to what was going to happen for the rest of my life, which is old age, sickness, and death, the suffering of samsara. It's built in. It's not because you committed a sin. It's not because Adam committed a sin. It's not because, you know, somehow you have bad luck. This is what life is. And so I don't expect it to be anything else. I expect old age, sickness, and death. And Allen was incredibly meticulous at mapping his own, increasing physical ailments, but also his increasing exuberance. I got one of those famous phone calls in the week before he died, where he would just call people up who had meant something to him and talk to them. And he told me that he had been diagnosed with terminal liver cancer, which I knew because the office had faxed me or whatever. And I asked him how he felt, and he said, exhilarated.
Yeah.
And he talked about how poetry's final subject, as he called it, was in sight. And that has been tremendously encouraging to me. That even, after a terminal diagnosis, he could feel a sense of joy and anticipation of discovery at the same time that he acknowledged that suffering was built into life, and that it wasn't some extra thing that got added on if you were screwed. Like everybody gets screwed.
Don't you love that title? Don't you love that poem title of his right at the very end? Sleeping with my skeleton.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It says it all. Yeah, I remember at the very end of his life, he was talking about aging and the body falling apart. And I said, yeah, it's really mythic, isn't it? And he said, yes. And he got so excited, Okay, let's see. I want to think if there's a question to wrap things up with before we get into question and answers. And, you have all of these glorious obsessions. You know probably more about jazz than just about anybody I know. And I've gotten so many great, recordings and tips from you. You recently wrote a really brilliant essay that I encourage people to go online and find. It was published by The Believer, about Bill Evans and a song called Nardis, which is a song that Miles Davis wrote but never performed. So it's performed by all these people who have different versions, but it's about something to which there is no original. There are only versions of. Would you talk a little bit about this exquisite obsession you've had with Nardis and Bill Evans' obsession, and just give us a little bit of a take on that, please?
Sure. Yeah, the article is called Broken Time. It was published in The Believer, and it was the result of a dream assignment from The Believer, which was, if you could write about whatever you wanted, what would you write about? And I went back to the editor with an unlikely request. I said, I have about 150 versions on my, iTunes of this composition called Nardis, and it's very haunting, and it was written by Miles Davis, but he never recorded it, but all these other people did, and Bill Evans recorded it many, many times, and what I write about was that there is an incredible arc of performances of that piece, only by Bill Evans even, although all the other versions are interesting too, or most of them. But right before Bill Evans died, he had played this song hundreds of times in his sets. He played it almost every night in his entire career. But literally a few days before he died, he recorded kind of the ultimate version in this club. It's only out there on a bootleg. I was lucky enough to get a copy. And the journey of that piece in his life, as his life was distinguished by both being regarded as one of the best and most influential jazz pianists of, the late 20th century. And also at the same time, he was a terrible junkie, and he died of complete physical degeneration caused by junk and cocaine. And so that was that imperfection that I was talking about earlier in regards to my teachers. Bill Evans was both exquisite and exquisitely fucked up. And I wrote about how both of those things came together in these versions of this incredibly haunting tune. So if anybody wants to see what I write about when I'm not writing about medicine and science, Broken Time is probably my favorite thing that I've ever written.
Yeah, and I know I said that was the last question, but Miko, you can break in any time you want. But Steve, you have a really important presence in social media, on Facebook, on Instagram now, on Twitter, and you are the loyal opposition to what's going on politically in this country. I really respect and admire the level of outrage that you maintain over what's going on in Washington and this band of criminals who we're all living under. How do you do it? And
well, I meditate every day still, thank God, which really helps. I cannot claim to not be going crazy.
Yeah.
I am. You asked me in email last night, like, what am I reading? What I'm reading is the news, because I'm obsessed. And it goes deeper than just like some partisan disagreement. I think what we're seeing in Washington is the kind of thing that the Beats would have addressed, which is sort of an enforced trance or enforced dream state or enforced system of delusions. So people literally cannot see what is in front of their faces. And what should be in front of everyone's faces now is the fact that thousands of Americans are dying every day. And somehow, because they have absolute command of the media in a way that Burroughs certainly would have written about and appreciated, they're able to frame it, it's only 70,000 now. We thought it might be 100,000, so it's actually a victory. No, it isn't. Thousands of people are dying every day. Thousands of nurses are dying because the masks that they need are being sold off by Republican assholes, and so yes, I am completely outraged, but it's beyond political or partisan outrage. It's almost a spiritual outrage that they're keeping people in this dream state so that a nightmare is happening all around them, but they don't recognize it, and they refuse to admit it. And that, I find that really sort of cosmically disturbing. I feel like the karma of, the first federal prisoner to die of coronavirus in the system was a Native American woman who had just given birth on a ventilator. The karma of that is so unbelievably horrific that, in a way it calls for a poetic response. Yes. But, I haven't, I'm sure there are poets out there that are doing great, but I feel like we still need something like Howl, but for now, to wake everybody up out of this trance.
Yeah, and I think for you and I, having lived through the whole AIDS situation, this really brings that back, not only in the sense that the slightest fever or sore throat could potentially mean a death sentence, but also the silence equals death and the oppression that went with it, and just the whole attempts to keep people in a dream state, to perpetuate this, simply not speaking the name, for one thing. Yeah. How are you dealing with the present situation? I guess as writers and people who work at home every day, putting together books, and I mean, us introverts have a little bit of an advantage, but it's still, there's so much suffering out there. How are you doing right now? And what do you miss about life before this virus came along? What do you miss most?
Well, I alternate. I sometimes describe myself as an extremely extroverted introvert. I alternate periods of intense and kind of hopefully industrious solitude with intense socializing. And I've had that, and I don't mean going to parties. I mean hanging out with one person or two people, often listening to music, getting high, etc. That's what I like to do. That's my idea of fun. And I miss that. I miss my friends. Luckily, it's kind of nice to talk to people on video, as we're doing now. And even some of my older friends have kind of stepped up in this historical moment and have been talking to me more. And so that's kind of, what has taken the place of that kind of socialization. But I miss hugging people. I miss being outside. I miss that feeling of discovery when you're with someone you really like and you go do stuff. I had a glorious week in New York with a friend of mine named Drew back in November. And it was like the best week I've ever had in New York. And it's so weird to think that we couldn't do any of the things that we did that week now. We couldn't go to, the film showings. We couldn't go to the restaurants. That New York is now part of, the country that we no longer live in.
I was thinking the other day, gee, what do I really miss? I miss going to anthology film archives at night and being in a room with 20 other people who are there to see some really weird underground film, and then going out to the Himalayan cafe afterwards for noodles, and that's what I miss. What I hope is that after this crisis, well, certainly one thing it does is it gives lie to this whole idea of a for-profit healthcare system. That's got to go.
Absolutely.
I mean, I hope it reorganizes and reorients the whole capitalist system, because we really need to get more into a socialist footing. And I think that we need to have a guaranteed minimum income, because people who have lost their jobs, who are getting a little bit of support, are being incredibly creative now. And, people need this floor under them in the best of times. And they're still going to be creative and work even more so. We need to re-examine consumerist culture. I never understood when they talked about the American economy relying on the consumer. I mean, the biggest economy in the world depends on people going in and out of big box stores, buying stuff they don't need. There's so much that has to be looked at again. And also we're possibly, as a scientist said the other day, in the second inning of a 9-inning game with this. We don't know where it's going to go.
Raymond, let me ask you a question. Before we get to the questions, and I know that we're running short on time, could I read a very short poem by Michael McClure? Just to honor his fascinating. It's very, very short, but it's lovely. It's called Fragment, and it was written for Baker Roshi, the Zen master who was my teacher. Ah, yes, how perfect to be within a dream, inside a body, in a vision. How real, how solid. I am the body. The dream is flesh. Appearance is my breath. I am the hummingbird of chance.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Miko, do we want to jump into questions?
This would be a good opportunity. Yeah, we have some questions. Thank you guys so much. It was really great conversation, really inspiring. I have a question here from Riley, one of our production assistants. I will read it on her behalf. She's typing closed captions now, I believe. So the question is about story in medicine, the role of storytellers before modern medicine. How can we cultivate the idea of story as medicine?
Well, I feel like Oliver Sacks actually did that in his books in a way that had a lasting effect on the people who came after him in medicine, in that I recently heard that the vast majority of students who were applying to a graduate program in neuroscience in New York had been inspired to do so by reading Oliver's books. And what he was pushing against was a completely data-driven form of medicine. I mean, I know when I go see my primary care physician, I see him for 2 minutes. He's obviously completely overtaxed and stressed out. He literally, waiting for him to come into the room. He comes in the room, talks to me for 2 minutes and splits. Then I go back home and look at the website, for the numbers, and there's not that healing exchange of storytelling unless I can squeeze it in that 2 minutes. And I feel like Oliver's books have made people understand that we're not going to really comprehend what conditions like autism and Tourette syndrome are without listening to the people who are autistic or the people who have Tourette syndrome. And in his introduction to NeuroTribes, Oliver pointed out that one of the things that made the book unusual in the autism world was that I listened to autistic people. And in fact, that had a decisive effect on the book. And what that was them telling me the stories of their lives that then I was hopefully able to weave together into a story that could change readers' minds about what autistic lives can be. And so, I feel like in my own writing, I'm trying to do that, as Oliver tried to do in his writing as well. And I would definitely recommend, there's a documentary about Oliver that's about to come out. It was supposed to be out already, but then coronavirus happened. It's called His Own Life. It's a fantastic documentary that will be shown. It'll be online eventually, about how Oliver used storytelling to understand his patients and then use storytelling to interest his readers in the conditions that his patients were grappling with.
Great, thank you. So our next question comes from Jane Richardson. So Jane, I will unmute you now. You should be unmuted. You want to ask your question?
Okay, yes, thanks so much. So I'm really curious about the lived human experience of autism, given the fact that for many autistic people, verbal communication is not their favorite thing. But what is expressed through art can be such a powerful way of giving voice to experience. And I'm really curious about what you have seen of this, and anything you might have to say about other languages for expression.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know exactly how to tie other languages in, but let me answer the first part of the question. Yes, I am very, very interested in not just autistic art, but so-called outsider art in general. If you look at my Twitter feed, just the other day, I tweeted a poem by a non-speaking apraxic person named Dustin. He wrote a poem called Typical. He's 21. It is not just a hilarious and witty poem about the expectations of normalcy that are focused on him every day as a non-speaking person, but it's formally a fascinating poem. He's got an incredible command of phonemes and unexpected use of rhyme schemes. And, in a previous generation, Dustin would have been written off as a non-person. He would have been called, quote unquote, mentally retarded. He didn't talk. There's a saying now in not just the autistic community, but the disability community in general. Just because you can't speak doesn't mean you have nothing to say. And so there's a lot of writing out there these days by people who are non-speaking. And one thing that I learned being around non-speaking autistics is that they're much more aware of their surroundings than you might think. And, the original writings about autism, as I talk about in NeuroTribes, were often, sort of wrote these people off as not being interested in interacting with other people, including their own parents. Well, that's not correct. And in fact, non-speaking people can have very deep, true perceptions about the emotional states of people around them. And if they have access to the appropriate technology for them, if they find that they can type, for instance, that can be a really a way of entering society and interacting with other people and making their internal world visible to other people. And so that's something I'm very interested in. And, we didn't talk about it before in this conversation, but one of the big inspirations for NeuroTribes was Allen Ginsberg's poem Kaddish, which is the poem that he wrote for his mother, who had schizophrenia. And it was a very tragic story. As a teenager, Allen was asked to sign a permission form for her to have a lobotomy, and the lobotomy eventually killed her. She died in an asylum. And his concern, not just for her, but for all the other quote unquote mad people in asylums everywhere, Allen was very Christ-like, which is a word he would never have applied to himself, in that he looked for the outsiders in society and included them in his vision. So junkies, people in insane asylums. I think his partner, Peter Orlovsky, I suspect that at least one of his brothers probably was a non-speaking autistic, and may still be alive even, I hear. But in any case, Allen included people who had been not just left out of society, but forcibly excluded, in an armed madhouse, as he put it. And that was very much an inspiration for NeuroTribes and for my centering of autistic people's experience in the narrative.
Great,
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
you.
Thanks.
So next, I believe our own Fong Bui has a question. Fong, I will unmute you now.
I'm unmuted. Thank you.
Cool.
Hi, thank you.
Thanks for coming on. Great to see you, Steve. It's been too long.
Thank you. Thank you.
Talking about Allen Ginsberg, poem and what you have been talking, and I just realized how significant it was when Madness and Civilization came out in '61, when Foucault published that book. Essentially was one of the first kind that traced the evolution of the whole concept of madness, dating from the Renaissance, when arguing that it was the mad was portrayed as having some kind of, gift or possession, a kind of wisdom, a knowledge that of limit to our world. I mean, they have a certain conduit to the cosmic force, for example, but it was during the Age of Enlightenment, certainly late part of the 17th to the whole 18th century, that when the whole idea of marginalizing them, consigning them to society margin, along with the prostitute, with the vagrant, blasphemer, and whatnot. And that's when the whole idea was creating mental institution and put them under the supervision of medical doctor and whatnot till modern day. And I remember a year later, Ken Kelsey, incredible book, One Flew Over Cuckoo's Nest. And that was 1962. The movie didn't get made until mid-70s by Milos Forman. We always remember Nicholson, playing McMurphy, and Louise Fletcher playing Nurse Ratched. So my question is that it was that period, and I wonder how much have changed. I know that Andrew Solomon's book came just before you, at least few years, and he make also a very strong case in that similar continuity. So I just want to see whether that had an impetus in your own book from the very beginning.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I read Andrew's book and I liked it very much. Obviously, I read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and saw the movie, and actually met Ken Kesey at Naropa. Yes, all of that. And it's important to remember that even before what I describe as the autism rights movement in my book, there were movements among disabled people to be included. And I would very much recommend a new documentary, which is on Netflix now, I believe, called Crip Camp, which talks about this camp just outside of New York City for really disabled people. These were not people with mild disabilities. These were people with cerebral palsy. The kids who went to that camp, which was run by hippies and was very accepting and empowering and built on some of the ideas put forth by people like Foucault, the kids who went to that camp ended up having a decisive role in the disability rights movement that eventually forced the federal government to sign the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the kids who went to that camp changed the world to be a better place for not just people with physical disabilities, but eventually people with cognitive disabilities like autism. And what they realized in that camp was that they deserved better lives. They deserved lives of agency and lives where they were making their own decisions. And if you can barely talk, convincing the world that you have the autonomy to make your own decisions is not always easy. And the movie shows how the kids were able to support each other and do that. And that notion of peer support, I think, is what turned the ideas of people like Foucault into political realities. So that this bonding force between people with various disabilities and across various disabilities as well was able to develop enough leverage that they changed the world and made it a better place for everyone, really. Because things like accommodation for disability tend to have cascading, unexpected positive effects, like closed captioning, invented for people who can't, for deaf people. But everybody loves it, when they're reading headlines at the gym on the television or whatever. Curb cuts, they're good for people in wheelchairs. They're also good for moms with strollers. So it's like if you make the world more inclusive for all different kinds of humanity, and if you give everyone the best chance of success, the world becomes better for everyone, which I feel like is sort of the opposite of the model of the world that is prevailing now, where the world is getting worse for everyone. I mean, the Trump administration's approach to elderly, poor, disabled, people of color, it's become eugenics at this point. They're letting coronavirus burn like a brush fire through nursing homes and institutions as if those people are expendable. And yes, they're not using gas chambers, they're using a virus. But these are policy decisions. This is not just some unforeseeable catastrophe. It was very foreseeable. And a number of tests for coronavirus are being kept artificially low, so we won't even know why everyone's dying around us. It's incredible. And I'm hoping that we can really take back power in this country, because these people are as evil as I've ever seen in 62 years on Earth.
Yeah, you can also add prisons and ghettos and Native American reservations to that list. And I think we're living in a world which really started with Ronald Reagan and then continued through Bush and today Trump. I think Reagan really started this war on the middle class, and it's something we've got to turn around. And we have to support people like Stacey Abrams, and we have to get involved with Swing Left. There are some really fine people out there, and people have to make phone calls and knock on doors. And it's incredible. I used to, in high school, go to meetings of the Lowell Peace Action Coalition with John Kerry, who had just come back from Vietnam. And, Kent State was just the other day, and I remember all of that and going to demonstrations. And then I think, my God, it never stops. But it's true, it never does stop. I mean, Amiri Baraka, that's what he said, the struggle goes on. And even if the people you vote for get in, you still have to struggle against them and struggle with them. So,
yeah,
absolutely.
Thank you, Steve.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul.
Well, Perhaps we should wrap up. Is that okay?
Thanks, guys, so much. Yeah, we have some questions, but
oh, sure.
we should definitely
yeah, sure.
do a part. We should definitely do a part 2 because there's a bunch of questions, so maybe we can do that.
How do you feel, Steve? Is this good?
It's okay. Yeah, it's good. No problem. No problem. As long as people aren't getting bored, go for it.
Well, someone had a question, but I think they might have left, but I'm also curious and would love to ask on their behalf. It was from Evangelos Bazakis. Just wanting to know more about both of your next projects.
Oh, sure. Well, right now I'm working on a history of cystic fibrosis, which is weirdly relevant to the coronavirus situation because people with cystic fibrosis, which is a degenerative lung disease that used to kill you when you were a few months old, and then doctors developed protocols that would keep people alive into their teens and then into their 20s and into their 30s. It's one of the greatest success stories in 20th century medicine that hardly anybody knows about because A, it's relatively rare, but B, it's kind of, it's gross. It's a condition that, you know, basically where the mucus in your lungs gets really thick and you become very susceptible to infections. So people with cystic fibrosis have been practicing social distancing for a very, very long time. They understand how easy it is to pick up a flu because somebody sneezes on you at the grocery store. And so in a way, it's like we're all living the lives now of people like my friend Phil, who was really the inspiration for my next book, which is going to be called The Taste of Salt. It'll probably be out in a couple of years. I'm still relatively at the beginning of the process. But it's a great story. The man who discovered the so-called basic defect in cystic fibrosis was a guy with cystic fibrosis himself, who studied the sweat glands in his own arms to figure out what was happening with his body, which is an amazing story. Hardly anybody knows about that. You know, now there's this added kind of intensity because when I started writing the book, I would want to talk to people and then they would, you know, be listed for a lung transplant and, you know, they might not survive. And so I had this sense that I was writing about a community that was in a very perilous situation. Now it could be me who doesn't survive. So it's, you know, it's become a very intense writing situation for me. Raymond, what are you working on?
Well, as they said in the intro, I'm working with George Scrivani on the last 20 years of Gregory Corso's poetry, which he never got to publish because his work was changing so much and he was dealing with a lot of new issues, including early childhood trauma. And he was changing his style and he never really got around to putting this book together, and it's languished. I mean, Gregory died in, I think, the year 2000, early 2001. And so working on that, working on a collected poems of Rene Ricard, working on a monograph on the work of Jordan Belson, who is an extremely important experimental filmmaker and artist. And I think that's something where my interest in Buddhism and meditation and yoga really has come into play in my having a real understanding and appreciation of an artist like Belson, who was an extreme recluse. I wrote him a letter in 1976 asking if I could meet him, and he finally agreed to see me in 2001. Hearing you talk about NeuroTribes and reading it, I thought how many friends of mine in the artistic community, if not dealing with autism, have dealt with bipolar problems, with certainly with depression, and struggled with all of these things, and through them found a way to give us a vision, which is which is so moving and encouraging, and that we can really live our lives by. I mean, aesthetics for me is not some kind of flighty dilettante thing. It's very much about living one's life and getting through the next 24 hours and having some really encouraging things to get through these horrible times. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
We have one more question, and I think we'll go to our poem after that from our own Nick Bennett.
Hey, Nick.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you both so much. This conversation is incredible. I could listen to it all day long. And I just really felt what Steve said there about speaking about people with cystic fibrosis. And I just hope that, you know, we all foster that sense of empathy long after we leave our homes and go on with our lives. But one thing that I found really interesting, Steve, that you mentioned was your involvement with Naropa. And it's really such a radical place. And it's, you know, like the rail in a way, it's free, I believe. And we're in a moment where institutions are facing a lot of changes that will be coming up. And I'm just curious if you think that there's a way that institutions can look at places like Naropa as a model, or should they, or can they, or will they?
Well, I mean, the first thing is I don't think Naropa is free, because I've had a bunch of friends need to get scholarships to go there. So I'm not sure if Naropa is a perfect example of a thriving alternative institution. But it's someone I see in chat just said it isn't free. It isn't.
I do, yeah.
However,
I do. Sorry, I take that back.
Yeah, no problem. The one thing I will say was that the Naropa that I went to, both in 77 and 87, was a model in a different way, in that it was a very intense cross-cultural exchange among people from a wide diversity of backgrounds and disciplines and interests. And I remember sitting in Allen's apartment at Varsity Apartments or whatever in Boulder, and someone in the apartment had just discovered a bunch of ancient Greek musical notations and had figured out how to read them and interpret them. And someone else in the apartment at that moment was a dancer. And so they just spontaneously agreed to work on a piece where she would dance to this music that had been written, you know, in Greece hundreds of years ago. And all kinds of things like that would happen because you put very creative people together. And I feel like the Rail is another example of that. The Believer that published my essay on Nordis, Broken Time, is another example of that. And as long as these places, which are always struggling to survive on a shoestring, like, you know, the thing I did not know, because I was a naive teenager when I went to Naropa, was that Allen was, Naropa was, it seemed to be like this magnificent institution when I went there. And, eventually they had the Allen Ginsberg Library and all this. It was on a shoestring. Allen would have to beg his friends to come teach there, and, then they would get paid or not. It was barely surviving all the time, even in its golden age. But it made amazing things happen because it put really curious, really artistically ambitious, really intelligent, really skilled people together, and then just gave them a sense of absolute freedom. And I try to sort of, my whole life, I've tried to sniff the air. Where is that happening now? And so that's partly why I'm here now, sitting in this chair talking to you guys, is because I feel like Brooklyn Rail has that feeling now,
Well, thank you, and sorry for that.
No problem.
Spreading a little bit of misinformation, but nonetheless, I do appreciate what you've said, and I do hope that other institutions can look to the more experimental and open, and where the artists are.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think we've all admired Black Mountain College, that model, the free school, Rosa Luxemburg, and I hope that we can find a way to continue these models, because this thing where students have to pay $60,000-$80,000 a year and they go into debt for the rest of their life over this, education industry, which is a form of indentured servitude, that's got to change too. That's got to end.
Yeah.
I hope.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
So unfortunately, we've come to the end, but yes, as I said, we should definitely have a part 2 one day. This is great. So now we at the Rail have a tradition of reading a poem, and today our poet is our very own Riley Mang. But before that, I just want to say the next social environment tomorrow, it will be special. It will be with Metabolic Studios, so it's a collaboration with them. It's a little something different, and our guest will be Dr. Vandana Shiva and the host Lauren Bond. So that will be tomorrow at 1 p.m. And now I will hand it over to Riley so she can read her poem.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Miko. Thank you for being part of this conversation, Raymond and Steve. I really enjoyed listening to you guys speak. I also wanted to just say Ramadan Mubarak for everyone observing this holy lunar cycle, and also Happy Mother's Day to all the moms out there. I'll read a poem by a poet who's from my home state of Washington, and she also has Palestinian, Jordanian, and Syrian heritage. I also chose it to go along with the May issue's critics page, which contemplates translation. So here is translation by Lina Khalaf Tufaha from her book Water and Salt, which was published by Red Hen Press in 2017. Okay, translation. She asks, "Why do you say mama when you call me? 6 o'clock and I am tired and making dinner right now. An Arab with a 5-year-old demanding neat and tidy American answers. I phone it in. That's just how Arabic works." Translation is a complicated dance. Mama is the word that holds you in even when you are walking around in the world with your own name. So that calling you to me, I discard the self and respond to the name you gave me, becoming the person you made me. Mama is a time-traveling word, a song to you and to my own mother, so that whenever I reach out to you, she is there too. I am calling you once again the daughter, tethered to her just as I am, locked in this lifelong embrace with you. I call myself and my own mother and you, all three of us, in one breath. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Lovely. Lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Steve. Thank you, Raymond, Riley, everyone. And we'll see you tomorrow. Feel free to say goodbye. Everyone, be unmuted now.
Goodbye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks
Hey,
a lot.
everybody.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Steve, thanks, Raymond.
Thank you. Wonderful, Raymond. Raymond, Steve.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, Rachel.
Thank you.
Good.
Bye, Andrew. Bye, Thomas. Bye, Juliet.
Thank you.
Hey, Peter.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Juan?